Sarah Mitchell never imagined that one simple act of kindness would shatter the walls around her struggling life and rebuild it into something she never dared to dream. On a cold November evening, exhausted from her janitor shift at the Grand Meridian Hotel, she paused to dance with a lonely disabled boy in a wheelchair, her worn uniform and calloused hands a stark contrast to the crystal chandeliers above them. She moved with him gently across the marble lobby, humming softly, treating him with pure tenderness, never knowing that the well-dressed man watching from the shadows was Marcus Dalton, a grieving billionaire who owned the hotel and 40 others like it. She had no idea he had been searching desperately for someone genuine, someone who could see past wealth and status to the wounded heart of his son. She could not have known that this one spontaneous moment of authentic compassion would transform both their broken worlds forever. Sarah Mitchell's hands told the story of her life better than words ever could. At 32 years old, they were the hands of someone much older, roughened by industrial cleaners and endless scrubbing. The skin cracked at the knuckles, the nails trimmed short out of necessity rather than style. She looked at them now as she stood in her tiny apartment. Those hands that worked so hard to hold her world together, and felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle into her bones. The apartment was small, barely more than a box with windows, but it was clean. And it was theirs. Emma's drawings covered one wall like a gallery of hope. Bright crayon flowers and stick figure families that seemed to mock the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter. The electricity bill was marked final notice in angry red letters. Emma's shoes sat by the door, the toes scuffed nearly white. 2 sizes too small but still being worn because new ones cost money Sarah simply did not have. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits, and Sarah allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to feel the crushing pressure of it all before she straightened her spine and lifted her chin. She had learned long ago that dignity was not something poverty could steal unless you surrendered it willingly. She glanced at the clock, her pulse quickening. 6:15 in the evening, time to begin the routine that shaped her nights. Emma was already dressed in her pajamas, her 7-year-old face bright with the resilience of childhood. They walked down the hallway together, Emma's small hand warm in hers, to Mrs. Chen's apartment 3 doors down. The elderly woman answered with a smile that creased her face into 1,000 kind wrinkles, and Emma hugged Sarah goodbye with fierce strength. The bus stop was 4 blocks away. Sarah walked quickly, her worn sneakers slapping against the pavement, her uniform already on beneath her thin jacket. The November wind cut through the fabric like it was nothing. On the bus, she sat near the back, watching the city transform from her neighborhood of struggling families and corner stores to the glittering downtown district where wealth lived and breathed. The Grand Meridian Hotel rose before her like a palace, all golden lights and marble steps. She entered through the service entrance, clocked in at exactly 7 o'clock, and became invisible. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The Grand Meridian Hotel existed in a different universe than the one Sarah inhabited. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings like frozen waterfalls of light, each one worth more than Sarah would earn in 5 years. The marble floors gleamed like mirrors, polished to impossible perfection, reflecting the designer shoes of guests who moved through the lobby with the confidence that comes from never having worried about money. Women in evening gowns that cost thousands of dollars glided past, trailing perfume that probably cost more per ounce than Sarah's hourly wage. Men in custom-tailored suits spoke into phones about deals and dividends, their voices carrying the particular arrogance of those who have never been told no. Sarah moved through this world like a ghost. She pushed her cleaning cart quietly, efficiently, her movements practiced and precise. She emptied trash bins filled with barely touched champagne bottles and discarded luxury shopping bags. She polished brass fixtures until they gleamed. She cleaned mirrors that reflected everything except her own existence. Guests looked through her as though she were made of glass, their eyes sliding past without acknowledgement, without seeing the human being in the worn uniform. She had become part of the furniture, another fixture in this temple of wealth. as unremarkable as the potted palms or the marble columns. But Sarah took pride in her work anyway. Every surface she touched became cleaner. Every detail mattered to her, even if it mattered to no one else. Her supervisor, Mr. Hendricks, was a thin man with a perpetual expression of disapproval carved into his narrow face. He watched the cleaning staff like a hawk circling prey, always ready to pounce on the smallest mistake. He spoke to Sarah in clipped tones that dripped with disdain, as though addressing her at all was beneath him. Near the elevator bank, Sarah spotted a leather wallet lying against the baseboard. She picked it up, opened it to find identification, and saw the thick stack of credit cards and cash inside. Without hesitation, she brought it to the front desk, handed it to the concierge, explained where she had found it. The concierge took it with barely a glance at her face. "No, thank you," crossing his lips. Sarah returned to her cart and continued working, her invisible hands maintaining the visible perfection that wealth demanded. It was nearly 11 o'clock when Sarah moved into the main lobby with her cart. The quiet hour when most guests had retired to their rooms and the vast space echoed with emptiness. The chandeliers still blazed overhead, casting their expensive light on marble that gleamed like ice. And in the corner, near the grand piano, Sarah noticed something that made her hands still on the handle of her cleaning cart. A boy sat alone in a wheelchair. He could not have been more than 10 years old. His clothes were expensive in that unmistakable way that wealth announces itself. A navy cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, perfectly pressed khaki pants, shoes that gleamed with newness. The wheelchair itself was clearly top of the line. Sleek black metal with custom details, the kind of medical equipment that spoke of unlimited resources, but none of that mattered when Sarah looked at his face. His eyes were what stopped her heart. They were dark and large and filled with a loneliness so profound it seemed to radiate from him like cold air. He was staring at the empty space beside the grand piano, the small stage area where musicians sometimes performed for the hotel's wealthy guests, and his expression held a yearning that Sarah recognized in her very bones. It was the look of someone searching for something that had been lost, something that could not be bought or replaced. Sarah stood there, her worn hands gripping the cart, and felt her maternal instinct rise up like a wave. She thought of Emma, safe and warm at Mrs. Chen's apartment, probably already asleep with her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Emma had so little in material terms, but she had love. She had presence. She had a mother who was there even when exhaustion made every movement feel impossible. This boy, surrounded by luxury, sitting in a wheelchair that cost more than Sarah's car had before it died, looked like the loneliest child in the world. He had everything money could buy. He had nothing that mattered. In a shadowed alcove near the lobby, hidden behind a marble column and a strategically placed palm, sat a man who owned everything in sight. Marcus Dalton was 40 years old, though grief had aged him in ways that numbers could not measure. He was handsome in that way that wealth often preserves, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair touched with distinguished gray at the temples, but his eyes carried an exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. His suit was custom-tailored, Italian wool that cost more than most people earned in a month, but he wore it with the indifference of someone who had stopped caring about appearances. On his left hand, a wedding ring still circled his finger, the gold band he had worn for 12 years. Though Catherine had been dead for 2, he could not bring himself to remove it. He sat in the shadows and watched his son Daniel, as he had done countless times before, observing the small cruelties of indifference that played out like a familiar script. A couple in evening wear walked past Daniel's wheelchair, their eyes sliding away with practiced ease, as though looking at a disabled child might somehow contaminate their perfect evening. A hotel guest pulled his daughter closer as they passed, the gesture subtle but unmistakable, as if disability were contagious. The hotel staff were professionally polite when they had to be, offering assistance with voices that were correct and cold, maintaining the appropriate distance that service demanded. No one saw Daniel. They saw the wheelchair. They saw a problem. They saw something that made them uncomfortable. Marcus had been conducting this test for months now, bringing Daniel to different hotels in his collection, watching from the shadows, waiting for someone to prove him wrong. He desperately wanted to be wrong. He wanted to believe that genuine compassion still existed in the world, that kindness could exist without expectation of reward, that somewhere in this cold universe there was still a human heart that beat with authentic warmth. So far, he had found nothing. Every interaction had been transactional or avoidant. Every person had failed. Marcus had lost faith in people. Somewhere in the hotel's sound system, a switch was flipped, and soft classical music began to float through the lobby like a gentle mist. It was Debussy, delicate and dreaming, the kind of music that seems to come from another world. Sarah saw the change in the boy immediately. His face, which had been still as stone, shifted, not quite a smile, but something close to it, a softening around his eyes, a slight parting of his lips. The loneliness remained, but now it was joined by something else. Something that looked almost like hope. Sarah felt her heart squeeze in her chest. She remembered just 3 days ago, Emma coming home from school with a bright flyer clutched in her small hands, talking excitedly about the mother-daughter dance that all her friends were going to attend. The tickets were $50. Sarah had seen her daughter's face fall when she explained, as gently as possible, that they could not afford it this year. "Perhaps next year, sweetheart," she had said, hating the promise she might not be able to keep. Now, looking at this boy whose face had brightened at the sound of music, Sarah forgot about her cleaning cart entirely. She walked toward him slowly, cautiously, as one might approach a wounded bird. When she reached his wheelchair, she knelt down slightly so their eyes were level, and she spoke in a voice that was simple and kind. "Hello," she said. "I'm Sarah." The boy's eyes widened with surprise. People did not speak to him this way, did not see him first, and the wheelchair second. He hesitated, then replied softly that his name was Daniel. They talked about the music for a moment, Sarah commenting on how beautiful it was, Daniel nodding with an eagerness that suggested he rarely had anyone to share such thoughts with. Then, almost without meaning to, Daniel said something that changed everything. "My mother used to dance with me to music like this," he whispered, his voice cracking with pain so raw it seemed to fill the entire lobby. "Before she died." The words hung in the air between them like fragile glass. Sarah felt her heart break completely, shattering into pieces for this child, who had lost what she still had. Daniel looked up at Sarah, and in his eyes she saw something gathering, some fragile courage building like a wave. His hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, and he asked a question that seemed to cost him everything. "Would you dance with me?" The words came out barely louder than a whisper, but they echoed through Sarah's entire being like thunder. She stood frozen, stunned into absolute stillness. She was wearing her janitor's uniform, the fabric worn thin in places, a small stain on the sleeve from where she had scrubbed a particularly stubborn mark earlier. She had been working for 6 hours straight, and exhaustion lived in every muscle of her body. She was acutely aware that Mr. Hendricks could appear at any moment, that fraternizing with guests was explicitly forbidden, that she could lose this job she desperately needed. She glanced around the lobby nervously, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The rational part of her brain screamed all the reasons this was impossible, all the ways this single decision could destroy the fragile stability she had built for Emma and herself. But then she looked back at Daniel's face, at the hope flickering there like a candle flame in the wind. Hope that was already beginning to dim because he expected rejection. He had asked this question before. She could see it in his eyes. He had asked and been refused. Sarah thought of Emma, of how her daughter's face had fallen when told they could not afford the dance. She thought of this boy who had lost his mother, who sat alone in a wheelchair in a hotel lobby, asking a janitor to dance with him because he had no one else. She knelt down to his level, her worn knees touching the cold marble floor, and she said one word: "Yes." In the shadows, Marcus Dalton sat forward so quickly he nearly knocked over the small table beside him. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair. He had watched Daniel ask this question 5 times in the past 3 months. A hotel manager had said she was too busy. A guest had laughed uncomfortably and walked away. A waitress had said it was inappropriate. A concierge had offered to find someone else. A nurse had explained it was not in her job description. This woman in a janitor's uniform, This stranger with tired eyes and calloused hands was the first person to say yes. Sarah stood and moved behind Daniel's wheelchair, her hands gentle on the handles, positioning them in the center of the lobby where the marble stretched wide and empty. Then she came around to face him, and she took his hands in hers. His hands were small and warm and trembling slightly. She began to walk backward slowly, her steps measured and careful, guiding his wheelchair in rhythm to the Debussy that floated through the air like something holy. She hummed along softly, her voice worn but sweet. And she looked at Daniel not with pity but with complete dignity, as though they were not a janitor and a disabled boy in a hotel lobby at midnight, but a prince and princess at a grand ball in some fairy tale kingdom. The crystal chandelier above them scattered light like 1,000 fallen stars, and the music wrapped around them like silk, and for this one perfect moment, the world became beautiful. Daniel's face transformed. The loneliness that had carved itself into his features melted away like ice under sun. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and made them shine with something Sarah had not seen there before. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated, childlike joy. He laughed, a sound of surprise and delight, and Sarah laughed too, her exhaustion evaporating like morning dew. She forgot the unpaid bills stacked on her counter. She forgot her aching feet and her calloused hands. She forgot Mr. Hendricks and the rules and the job she needed. She forgot everything except this child and this moment, and the simple human act of bringing happiness to someone who needed it desperately. They moved together across the marble floor, an unlikely pair bound by music and kindness. Other hotel staff had stopped their work to stare. A concierge stood frozen at his desk, disapproval clear on his face. Two housekeepers whispered to each other, shaking their heads. A security guard frowned, clearly debating whether to intervene. Sarah noticed none of them. She saw only Daniel, smiling at last. The music was still playing when Mr. Hendricks appeared like a storm cloud. His face twisted with fury. His voice cut through the lobby like a knife, sharp and cold and filled with outrage. "Mitchell," he snapped, her last name an accusation on his lips. "What do you think you are doing?" Sarah stopped moving immediately, her hands still holding Daniel's, her face going pale. She opened her mouth to explain, to tell him about the boy's request, about his mother, about simple human kindness, but Hendricks did not allow her to speak. "You are on company time," he continued, his voice rising with each word. "You are disturbing a guest. You are neglecting your duties. This is completely unacceptable behavior. Do you have any idea how inappropriate this is?" Sarah felt her cheeks burning with humiliation. Around the lobby, the other staff members watched with expressions ranging from sympathy to satisfaction. She tried again to speak, her voice small. "Sir, he asked me to, and I just thought." "I do not pay you to think," Hendricks interrupted viciously. "I pay you to clean. Now, get back to your cart immediately, or I will dock your pay for the time you have wasted. Better yet, I should write you up for this infraction." Daniel's voice rose weakly from his wheelchair, a protest forming on his lips. But Hendricks did not even glance at him. The boy was furniture, irrelevant to this discipline of an employee who had forgotten her place. Sarah released Daniel's hands gently, carefully, as though letting go of something precious. "I am so sorry," she whispered to him, her voice thick with emotion. She turned away, her head down, and walked back to her cleaning cart with legs that felt like lead. Her cheeks were burning, her throat was tight. As she gripped the cart's handle, she glanced back one final time at Daniel. The smile was gone from his face. The joy had been extinguished as thoroughly as if someone had thrown water on a flame. He sat in his wheelchair looking smaller somehow, lonelier than before, and Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes, not for herself, not for the humiliation or the threatened pay dock, but for him, for this child whose brief moment of happiness had been stolen away. In the shadows, Marcus Dalton stood up, his face transformed by an emotion that looked very much like rage. Marcus Dalton moved from the shadows like a man who had been holding himself back with great effort. He crossed the lobby in long strides, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble with authority. and he approached Mr. Hendricks with the kind of quiet intensity that makes the air feel electric. Sarah could not hear what he said. He spoke in tones too low to carry, leaning close to Hendricks with words that seemed to drain the color from the supervisor's face. Hendricks went pale as snow, his expression shifting from fury to shock to something that looked very much like terror. He began nodding rapidly, his earlier confidence evaporating like smoke. "Yes, sir," Sarah heard him say, the words tumbling out. "Of course, sir. I apologize, sir. I did not realize." Hendricks actually backed away, practically bowing, before he retreated completely, disappearing into the back offices like a man fleeing judgment. Marcus turned then, and he walked toward Sarah with purpose. She stood frozen by her cleaning cart, confused and deeply embarrassed, wishing the marble floor would open and swallow her whole. Marcus stopped before her, and his face was gentle despite the expensive suit and the air of authority that surrounded him like cologne. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying profound sincerity. "Thank you for your kindness to my son." Sarah blinked, understanding flooding through her. This was Daniel's father. She felt her embarrassment deepen. "I am so sorry," she began. But Marcus shook his head and extended his hand. He introduced himself only as Daniel's father, nothing more. And when Sarah placed her rough, work-worn hand in his, she felt him pause, felt him notice the calluses and the cracked skin that told the story of her life. He asked her name, and she told him, her voice barely steady. They stood there for a moment, this janitor and this stranger, and Sarah found herself looking into his eyes. They were dark and deep and filled with a sadness so profound it made her own struggles feel almost small. Despite his expensive suit, despite the authority he clearly commanded, he looked like a man who was drowning. She saw grief there, raw and unhealed. She saw gratitude, too, genuine and overwhelming. Marcus returned to Daniel, placing a hand on his son's shoulder with tenderness that made Sarah's throat tight. They left together, Daniel glancing back at her with something like hope still flickering in his eyes. Sarah stood by her cart and watched them go, puzzled, but deeply touched, not knowing she had just met the man who owned everything around her. The next evening, Sarah arrived for her shift with a knot of anxiety in her stomach, expecting consequences from the previous night. Instead, she walked into something that felt like an alternate reality. Mr. Hendricks was waiting for her near the time clock, and when he saw her, his entire demeanor had changed. He spoke to her with nervous respect, his voice careful and measured, as though she were made of glass that might shatter. "Mitchell," he said, and the word carried none of yesterday's venom. "Mr. Dalton called this morning. Personally. He wanted to commend your excellent service, your attention to our guests, your compassion." Sarah stared at him blankly. "Mr. Dalton," she repeated, the name meaning nothing to her. Her supervisor, she called him sir. "Yes," Hendricks said, his smile strained. Mr. Dalton was very impressed. As Sarah moved through her shift, she became aware of eyes following her. Her co-workers whispered in clusters, their conversation stopping abruptly when she approached. They stared at her with expressions she could not quite read, mixtures of curiosity and something that might have been awe or might have been resentment. Finally, during her break, Maria cornered her in the staff room. Maria was one of the housekeepers, a woman in her 50s who had worked at the Grand Meridian for 20 years. "Sarah," Maria said in hushed, urgent tones, "do you know who Mr. Dalton is?" Sarah shook her head, confused. "Daniel's father? The man from last night?" Maria's eyes widened. "Marcus Dalton owns this hotel," she whispered, as though speaking too loudly might summon him. "He owns 40 hotels around the world. He is one of the richest men in the country. Billionaire rich." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She sat down heavily on the worn break-room chair, her mind reeling. She had danced with a billionaire's son. She had spoken to a billionaire in her stained janitor uniform, had shaken his hand with her calloused fingers, had looked him in the eye with complete unself-consciousness. She felt a strange mixture of embarrassment and profound relief wash through her. She had been so natural with them, so unguarded, precisely because she had not known who they were. She had treated them like people, not like money. She had seen a lonely child and a grieving father, nothing more and nothing less. And perhaps, she thought with sudden clarity, that was exactly why it had mattered. 3 days passed in a strange fog of normalcy. Sarah went to work, cleaned, came home to Emma, and tried not to think about the boy in the wheelchair or his father who owned everything. Then the letter arrived. It was handed to her by the front desk concierge with an expression of barely concealed curiosity. The envelope was thick, cream-colored paper, the kind that felt expensive between her fingers. And her name was written across the front in elegant script. Sarah waited until her break to open it, her hands trembling slightly as she tore the seal. The stationery inside was even more beautiful than the envelope, heavy and textured, and the handwriting was precise and masculine. "Dear Sarah," it began, and her heart began to beat faster. Marcus Dalton wrote about how rare, genuine kindness had become in his world, how most people wore masks of politeness that hid calculating hearts beneath. He wrote about Daniel, about how his son had not smiled with such pure joy since his mother Catherine died 2 years ago. And when he mentioned his wife's name, the grief bled through the ink like an open wound still raw and unhealed. He wrote that watching Sarah dance with Daniel had been the first time in 2 years he had felt something other than despair. He asked, with a formality that felt almost vulnerable, if Sarah would be willing to meet with him to discuss a proposition that might benefit them both. The letter was respectful, careful, the words of a man who understood he was asking something significant. He signed it simply, Marcus. Sarah read the letter 3 times, then 4. Her hands shaking so badly the paper rustled like leaves in wind. She sat in the break room staring at those elegant words and tried to imagine what a billionaire could possibly want from a janitor. A better position at the hotel, perhaps. Maybe he was offering her a promotion to janitorial supervisor, a raise that would help her pay the bills stacked on her counter. Maybe he wanted her to coordinate some kind of program for children with disabilities. She could not imagine what else it might be. The distance between their worlds was too vast, the gap too wide to bridge. But she remembered Daniel's smile, remembered the profound sadness in Marcus's eyes. And she thought about how they had both seemed so human despite all that money. She wrote back that same evening on notebook paper, her handwriting plain and simple. She agreed to meet him. The conference room was on the hotel's executive floor, a place Sarah had never been before. She wore her only good dress, a simple navy blue thing she had bought at a thrift store 3 years ago for Emma's school event. It was clean and pressed but obviously inexpensive, and she felt desperately out of place, surrounded by leather chairs and polished wood and abstract art that probably cost more than her car had. Marcus arrived exactly on time, dressed in a suit that looked effortlessly elegant. But his expression was warm rather than intimidating. He thanked her for coming, offered her coffee that she accepted with shaking hands, and then he began to explain. Daniel had withdrawn from the world since Catherine died, he said, his voice steady but carrying weight that spoke of sleepless nights and desperate worry. They had tried everything, therapists who specialized in childhood trauma, grief counselors, physical therapists and occupational therapists and specialists who came with credentials and references and price tags that would have made Sarah dizzy. Nothing had helped. Daniel had simply closed himself off, retreating into silence and sadness that no professional could penetrate. But after dancing with Sarah, Marcus continued, his eyes holding hers with intensity. Daniel had talked about it for days. He had asked when the kind lady might come back. He had smiled at dinner. He had shown interest in something for the first time in months. Marcus leaned forward slightly, and Sarah could see how much this request cost him, how vulnerable he was making himself. He asked if Sarah would consider spending time with Daniel, not as a nurse or therapist or any kind of medical professional, but simply as a kind person who saw him as a child first and everything else second. He would pay her generously, far more than she made at the hotel. Sarah felt overwhelmed, her mind racing. She thought about Emma, about the bills, about what that kind of money could mean for their lives. But she was also cautious. her instincts honed by years of struggling alone. This felt too good to be true, and things that felt too good to be true usually were. She asked careful questions about Daniel's needs, his interests, what his days looked like. Marcus's guarded expression softened as he talked about his son. Daniel loved music, he said. He loved drawing. His voice became tender, almost breaking, and Sarah saw past the billionaire to the father who was drowning and reaching for any lifeline he could find. Sarah asked for a day to think about it, and Marcus agreed without hesitation, giving her his private number written on a card that felt substantial in her hand. That night, after she picked up Emma from Mrs. Chen's apartment, after they ate their simple dinner of pasta and frozen vegetables, Sarah sat on the edge of Emma's bed and talked to her daughter carefully. Without revealing too much, "There was a boy," she said, "who was very sad and very lonely. His mother had died. He needed someone kind to spend time with him. Should she do it?" Emma looked at her with those wise 7-year-old eyes that sometimes seem to see more than they should. "You should help the sad boy if you can, Mama," she said simply. "You always help people." But after Emma fell asleep, Sarah's fears rose up like shadows in the dark. What if she failed? What if she made Daniel worse instead of better? What if this wealthy man had ulterior motives she was too naive to see? What if she was walking into something dangerous, something that would hurt Emma? She paced her tiny apartment, her mind spinning with doubt. Out of habit, without thinking, she picked up her phone and dialed her sister's number, the one that had been disconnected for 3 years since Julia died of cancer, leaving Sarah completely alone in the world. She listened to the automated message and felt tears burn her eyes, wishing desperately for advice from someone who had always known what to say. She thought about her own struggles, about understanding loss and loneliness from the inside. She thought about how she had recognized the grief in Marcus's eyes because she carried her own. She realized suddenly, clearly, that she was not being hired for credentials she did not have or training she had never received. She was being hired for her humanity, for the same quality that had made her kneel down and say yes when a lonely child asked her to dance. She could do this. She could help. The next morning, her hands steady now, she called Marcus's private number. She accepted his offer, but with one condition that was not negotiable. Emma must be part of this arrangement. She would not neglect her own child to help someone else's. If he wanted her humanity, he got all of it, including her role as a mother. Marcus agreed to Sarah's condition without a moment's hesitation. In fact, his voice on the phone carried something that sounded like respect, even admiration. "A mother who puts her child first," he said quietly. "That is exactly who I hoped you were." The arrangement began 3 days later. Marcus sent a car for them, which made Emma's eyes go wide with excitement and made Sarah feel intensely uncomfortable. The drive took them out of the city into an area where estates hid behind gates and walls, where wealth lived in carefully manicured privacy. When they arrived at Marcus's home, Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. The mansion was enormous, all stone and glass and perfectly maintained gardens that looked like something from a magazine. Inside was even more overwhelming. Marble everywhere, artwork that belonged in museums, ceilings so high her voice seemed to disappear into them. But as Sarah walked through those beautiful rooms, she felt something unexpected. Emptiness. Despite all its grandeur, the house felt hollow, like a beautiful shell with nothing living inside. It was a mausoleum of wealth, cold and echoing and profoundly lonely. Daniel was waiting in the main living room, his wheelchair positioned near the windows. He was shy when Emma bounded in, her 7-year-old energy filling the space like sunlight. He looked down at his hands, uncertain. Emma, unburdened by social anxiety or adult awkwardness, walked right up to him and stared at his wheelchair with undisguised fascination. "That is so cool," she announced. "Can it go fast? Does it have buttons?" "Can I see?" Daniel blinked, surprised. And then something miraculous happened. He smiled, just a little, and began explaining the features of his wheelchair to this enthusiastic girl who saw it as interesting rather than sad. The ice broke like spring thaw. Sarah suggested board games, and they settled around a low table. Marcus had retreated to his study, supposedly working on important business, but in reality he sat at his desk and watched through the open door as these simple interactions he had been unable to provide unfolded in his living room. Daniel laughed at one of Emma's terrible jokes, a real laugh that came from deep in his chest, and the sound echoed through the mansion like light breaking through darkness after a long, terrible night. Over the following weeks, something genuine and precious began to grow in that empty mansion. Sarah learned about Catherine from Marcus during quiet conversations that happened in stolen moments. She had been vibrant, he told her, his voice soft with memory. Full of life and laughter, the kind of person who made every room brighter just by entering it. She died in a car accident on a rainy November evening, and Daniel had been in the car with her. He survived, but his legs did not. And the guilt Marcus carried for not being there, for being away on business, had nearly destroyed him. Sarah shared her own story in return, speaking of things she rarely talked about. A brief marriage to a man who decided fatherhood was too much responsibility, who left when Emma was 2 years old, raising her daughter alone, working multiple jobs, choosing dignity over bitterness, even when bitterness would have been easier. Marcus listened with an intensity that made her feel truly heard for the first time in years. Emma and Daniel became fast friends despite their 3-year age difference. Emma treated his wheelchair as completely irrelevant. Just a fact of Daniel, like his brown eyes or his love of drawing. They played board games that ended in laughter and friendly arguments. They drew pictures together, Emma's wild, colorful creations next to Daniel's careful, detailed sketches. They watched movies curled up on the enormous couch, sharing popcorn and commentary. Daniel began to emerge from his shell like a flower opening to sunlight, his smiles coming more easily, his laughter more frequent. Marcus found himself drawn to the kitchen, where Sarah often went to prepare snacks for the children. Their conversations deepened, moving beyond surface pleasantries into territory that mattered. They talked about loss and how it changed you, about resilience and whether it was strength or just survival, about hope and whether it was foolish to believe in it. Marcus realized, with something like surprise, that he was healing too. Neither of them acknowledged the connection growing between them. The way their eyes met and held for moments too long, the way their hands brushed when reaching for the same cup, it felt too fragile to name, too precious to risk by speaking it aloud. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while they were in the middle of a board game. Sarah's phone rang, and when she saw the school's number, her heart immediately began to race. She answered, and the nurse's words turned her world into ice. Emma had collapsed during recess with severe abdominal pain. They had called an ambulance. She was being rushed to Memorial Hospital right now. Sarah's phone fell from her trembling hands. She stood up, her face drained of all color, panic flooding through her veins like poison. She had no car. The hospital was across the city. She needed to get to her daughter, and she had no way to reach her. Marcus saw her terror and moved instantly. His car was already running before Sarah could fully process what was happening. He arranged for his household staff to watch Daniel, then drove Sarah to the hospital with a controlled urgency that somehow made her feel less alone. At the hospital, Sarah was confronted with her worst nightmare. Emma needed emergency surgery for acute appendicitis. The appendix was close to rupturing. Without immediate intervention, the infection could become life-threatening. The doctor explained everything in calm, professional tones, but all Sarah heard was danger and surgery, and her baby girl in pain. Then came the financial office, asking about insurance, explaining costs. Even with her minimal insurance, the bills would be thousands of dollars she simply did not have. Sarah broke down completely in the hospital hallway, her back against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the cold linoleum floor. She could not lose Emma like she had lost Julia. She could not survive that. Marcus spoke quietly to the financial office, and suddenly the conversation about payment plans and deposits ended. He had handled it all. Sarah felt gratitude and humiliation crash over her in equal waves. She had failed as a mother. She could not even afford to save her own child. Marcus knelt beside her on that hospital floor and spoke words that changed something fundamental between them. He told her about his own failures, how all his money had not saved Catherine, had not prevented the accident, had not reached Daniel through his grief. Money was not protection, he said quietly. It was not love. It could not prevent loss. They were not so different, she and he. They were just two people, trying desperately not to fail the children they loved. Emma's surgery succeeded. As Sarah sat by her daughter's hospital bed watching her sleep, Marcus appeared with coffee and pulled up a second chair. He sat vigil with her through the entire night, neither of them speaking much, both of them simply present for the other in the darkness. During Emma's recovery, Marcus insisted that Sarah take time off from her janitorial job. He would continue paying her regardless. Sarah refused immediately, her pride flaring up like a flame. She had already accepted too much. She could not become a charity case. But then she looked at Emma, still pale and weak, and Marcus spoke one simple truth. Your daughter needs you right now. Everything else can wait. Sarah relented, and more than that, she agreed to bring Emma to the mansion for her recovery. The care would be better there, she reasoned. The guest room was more comfortable than their tiny apartment. Marcus had a private doctor on call. It was practical, she told herself, even as something deeper was really happening. During this intimate period, with Emma sleeping in the guest room and Daniel napping in his own room, the walls between Sarah and Marcus finally crumbled. Late one night, both children asleep, they sat in the mansion's library with the lights low and the world quiet around them. They had been talking about nothing important. And then suddenly they were talking about everything that mattered. Marcus confessed he had been frozen since Catherine died, just going through motions of living without actually being alive. He had been walking through his days like a ghost in his own life, present but not really there. Sarah admitted her deepest fear, the one that woke her in the night, that she was terrified she was not enough for Emma. Not smart enough, not successful enough, not able to give her daughter the life she deserved. Marcus looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He told her she was the most remarkable person he had ever met. Her strength in the face of impossible hardship, her grace when the world gave her every reason to be bitter, her capacity to still see others and their pain when she carried so much of her own. Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks, and she looked at Marcus and saw past his wealth to his wounded heart, to the man who was just as scared and broken as she was. They did not kiss, they did not make declarations of love. But something shifted between them irreversibly that night, a foundation settling into place that could support whatever might be built upon it. It was Daniel who asked the question that changed everything. They were in the garden, Emma picking flowers nearby, and he spoke to Sarah with a tentative hope that made her heart ache. "Would you consider staying?" he asked quietly, his hands gripping his wheelchair's armrests. Not as someone Dad pays, but as family. It was the first time since Catherine died that he had allowed himself to hope for a mother figure, and the courage it took him to speak those words was visible in every tense line of his body. Sarah felt torn in two. She cared deeply for Daniel, had come to love him like her own. She had feelings for Marcus that terrified her with their intensity, but she feared losing herself in their world, becoming someone she did not recognize, swallowed up by wealth and privilege, until Sarah Mitchell disappeared entirely. Emma came running over with a handful of dandelions, her recovery nearly complete, her energy restored. "I love it here," she announced happily. "I love Daniel like a little brother. Can we stay forever?" Her innocent words cut through Sarah's complicated thoughts like light through fog. That evening Sarah's phone rang. It was Mr. Hendricks, his voice professionally neutral. He informed her that her janitorial position had been restructured due to budget considerations. Her services were no longer required. Sarah hung up and stared at the phone, realizing with strange clarity that her old life was already gone. The small apartment, the night shifts, the exhaustion and the struggle. It was all already behind her, whether she acknowledged it or not. Marcus found her on the terrace, looking out at the gardens she had come to know. He did not pressure her or make grand speeches. He simply said something that reached the core of who she was. "You already know how to make a house a home," he told her gently. "You have been doing it in your small apartment with Emma all along. Space does not matter, Love does. Sarah looked at this man who had somehow seen her, truly seen her, and she thought about Daniel asking for family and Emma saying she loved it here. She thought about how empty this mansion had been and how it felt now, full of laughter and warmth and life. She made her decision. She would stay. 6 months later, the mansion had been transformed by something money could never buy. Sarah and Emma had moved in. Though Sarah had insisted initially on maintaining her own suite, some small piece of independence, she was not ready to surrender. But the transition happened naturally, inevitably, like water finding its level. They were becoming a family. Sarah learned Daniel's physical therapy routine, spending patient hours working with him, encouraging him, celebrating small victories. She discovered he could stand with leg braces, something he had refused to try since the accident. Together they worked until he took his first trembling steps, Marcus watching from the doorway, with tears streaming down his face. The house had laughter now, warmth radiating from every room. It was no longer a mausoleum, but a home. Marcus proposed on a quiet Tuesday evening with no fanfare or grand gestures. He knelt before Sarah in the library where they had first opened their hearts to each other, and he spoke Catherine's name with love and asked for her blessing in his heart before offering Sarah his future. She said yes, through tears that tasted like joy. They married in a small, intimate ceremony that was not for show, but for love. The guest list was tiny, just the people who mattered. The ceremony took place at sunset in the mansion's garden. Golden light spilling across the grass like honey. Daniel stood at the wedding, supported by his leg braces and his father's steady hand, refusing the wheelchair for this moment that mattered so much. Emma served as flower girl, scattering petals with serious concentration. After the vows were spoken and Sarah became part of this family in every legal and spiritual way, Daniel approached her with determination in his eyes. He asked if she would dance with him, his voice steady and sure. Not in a hotel lobby at midnight with a janitor's uniform and a stranger's kindness, but here, now, at his father's wedding, with the woman who had become his mother. Sarah took his hands, and they danced together while the last light faded from the sky. Tears streamed down her face, but they were good tears, healing tears. Marcus watched his son and his wife moving together, and for the first time since Catherine died, he felt complete. 3 years passed like a dream that became reality. Sarah had transformed the mansion into something Catherine would have recognized, a true home filled with warmth and laughter and the beautiful chaos of family life. She had also started something that mattered deeply to her, a foundation in Catherine's name that provided support for single parents struggling to make ends meet and children with disabilities who needed more than medicine could provide. The foundation gave scholarships and therapy and hope to families who had none. Daniel was thriving in ways that seemed miraculous until you remembered that love had always been the missing medicine. He attended school now, a private academy where his teachers saw his brilliant mind before they saw his wheelchair. He had friends who came over for video games and homework. His physical condition had improved dramatically through years of patient therapy, and though he still used his wheelchair most days, he could walk short distances with his braces, standing tall and proud. Emma was flourishing too, 13 years old now and wise beyond her years. She and Daniel had become the siblings neither of them had before, fighting and laughing and protecting each other with fierce devotion. Marcus was different too, transformed in ways both subtle and profound. He was softer now, more present, his laughter coming easily. He had stopped merely existing and started truly living again. One evening, the family visited the Grand Meridian Hotel, now operating under new compassionate management policies that Sarah had helped design, policies that treated staff with dignity and respect. As they walked through the lobby where crystal chandeliers still blazed like frozen stars, Sarah saw a woman pushing a cleaning cart. She was young, perhaps 25, wearing a worn uniform that had seen too many wash cycles. Her hands gripped the cart with the kind of exhaustion Sarah remembered in her bones. Their eyes met across the marble floor. Sarah smiled, not with pity but with recognition and profound respect. One woman seeing another across the chasm that no longer separated them. The janitor smiled back tentatively, surprised to be seen at all. Sarah thought of that November night 4 years ago, of the lonely boy who asked her to dance, of the choice she made without hesitation. The moral crystallized in her heart with perfect clarity. Authentic kindness transcends all barriers of class and circumstance. One moment of genuine humanity, freely given without expectation of reward, can heal broken hearts and build families from strangers. She had been invisible once, and now she was seen. She had been alone, and now she belonged. All because she had chosen, in one crucial moment, to see a child instead of a wheelchair, to offer compassion instead of indifference. She took Marcus's hand and felt Daniel's wheelchair bump gently against her leg as Emma chattered happily beside them. They left the hotel together, a family built not on wealth or status but on something far more precious, the simple human courage to be kind when kindness costs you something. That night, back in their home that was finally, truly, a home. Sarah stood in Daniel's doorway and watched him sleep. She thought about the dance that changed everything, about how one spontaneous act of love had rippled outward like light, touching lives and healing wounds, and proving that in the end, what matters most cannot be bought or sold. It can only be given freely, one human heart to another, in moments of pure and perfect grace.